Jamila had always loved her long braids. Every morning, her mother would carefully comb and braid her hair, and Jamila felt proud of how neat and beautiful it looked. Her braids were not just a hairstyle for her. They were a part of her identity, a connection to her culture and heritage. That morning, as Jamila walked into school, she felt excited. It was a regular Tuesday, and her school day had begun like any other. She had studied hard for the upcoming math test and was looking forward to meeting her friends during recess. She walked into Mrs. Henderson's classroom and took her usual seat near the window. Mrs. Henderson, the teacher, had always been a little critical of Jamila's appearance. She would often tell her that her braids were too thick or too long, but Jamila never thought much about it. She loved her braids and felt confident in them, and no one had ever told her that her hair was wrong before. That day, though, things were different. Mrs. Henderson stood in front of the class, looking at each student, and then her gaze landed on Jamila. She walked over to Jamila's desk, holding a pair of scissors in her hand. Jamila's heart started to race. Mrs. Henderson looked down at her braids with a disapproving frown. "Jamila," she said, "I'm afraid these braids are too long for the school dress code. I'm going to have to cut them." Jamila froze in shock. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. How could Mrs. Henderson do that? Her braids were perfectly fine. Her mother had always told her that she could wear her hair however she wanted, and this was the first time anyone had said her hair was a problem. "Please don't cut them," Jamila whispered, her voice trembling. "I love my braids. They're important to me." But Mrs. Henderson didn't listen. She simply shrugged and said, "It's the rules, Jamila. They need to be shorter. This is for your own good." Before Jamila could protest further, Mrs. Henderson took the scissors and snipped off a piece of her braid. Jamila felt a wave of sadness and embarrassment wash over her. She couldn't believe it. Her beautiful braids, something that had always made her feel proud, were now altered without her consent. The other students in the class looked on in silence, and Jamila could feel their eyes on her, though no one spoke a word. When the bell rang and the students filed out of the classroom, Jamila's heart was heavy. She felt humiliated. The walk home felt longer than usual. She tried to hide her tears, but they came anyway. How could Mrs. Henderson do something like this? Why was she singled out? As Jamila entered her home, her mother was waiting for her at the door, her face lighting up when she saw her daughter. But as soon as Jamila looked up at her mother, her tears started to fall. "Mom," she said, her voice breaking, "Mrs. Henderson cut my braids." Her mother's face turned serious, but before she could speak, Jamila's father, Mr. Williams, walked in from the other room. He could tell something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked, his voice soft but concerned. Jamila took a deep breath and told them everything. Her father's face grew dark with anger. He couldn't believe anyone would treat his daughter like that. He hugged Jamila tightly, promising that they would make things right. That evening, Jamila sat quietly in her room, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her once beautiful braids were now shorter, and she couldn't stop thinking about how she felt in Mrs. Henderson's classroom. The scissors had felt cold as they snipped through her hair, but the feeling of humiliation was even colder. It wasn't just about her hair. It was about being treated differently for something she had always loved. Jamila ran her fingers through the shorter strands of her hair, trying to hold back the tears. Her reflection seemed unfamiliar. The girl in the mirror didn't look like the confident Jamila she had been earlier that morning. Instead, she saw someone who had been hurt, someone whose identity had been shaken by the actions of someone who didn't understand or care about her. Downstairs, her parents were talking in the kitchen. Jamila could hear the quiet murmur of their voices, but she couldn't bring herself to join them. She felt small and vulnerable, as though something precious had been taken from her. Her mother, Mrs. Williams, eventually came upstairs to check on her. She knocked softly on Jamila's door before entering. Seeing her daughter's sad face, she sat down next to her on the bed. "Jamila," Mrs. Williams said gently, "I know you're upset. I'm upset too. But we'll figure this out, okay?" Jamila looked at her mother, Her eyes filled with tears. "Why did she do it, Mom? Why did Mrs. Henderson cut my hair? I didn't do anything wrong. I was just being me." Mrs. Williams sighed deeply. "I know, sweetheart, and it's not right. No one should make you feel like you're less than who you are. But sometimes people don't understand our culture or our identity. We need to make sure they do." Jamila wiped her eyes. "But what can we do? I don't want to go back to school tomorrow. I'm scared she'll do it again." Her mother smiled softly. "We'll make sure it doesn't happen again. I promise." That evening, Mr. Williams sat down with Jamila and her mother. He was upset, but he was also determined. He was going to make sure that his daughter's dignity was restored, and he wasn't going to let this slide. "I'm calling the school tomorrow," he said firmly. "We'll talk to the principal, and we'll make sure that Jamila's rights are respected. This isn't just about hair, it's about respect for who she is. And we're going to make sure she's treated right." Jamila felt comforted by her father's words. She had always known he would stand up for her, but hearing him say it out loud gave her a sense of hope. She wasn't alone in this. Her family was behind her, and together they would face whatever came next. The next morning, Jamila tried her best to push the previous day's events out of her mind as she prepared for school, but her stomach twisted with nerves. What would Mrs. Henderson say? Would other students tease her? As she walked out the door, her father gave her a hug. "Don't worry, Jamila," he said. "We'll take care of this. Just remember, you're strong, and you deserve to be treated with respect." Jamila nodded, feeling a little braver. She knew her family would fight for her, but deep down, she hoped that she wouldn't have to fight at all. She just wanted to go back to being herself. The next morning, Jamila woke up feeling a mixture of nervousness and determination. As she prepared for school, her mind kept racing back to the day before. Her father's words gave her some comfort, but she still wasn't sure what would happen at school. Would Mrs. Henderson act the same way? Would other kids treat her differently now that her hair was changed? Jamila's mother, Mrs. Williams, helped her gather her things and gave her a quick hug before she left. "Remember, sweetheart, we're going to talk to the school today. You're not alone in this." Jamila nodded, feeling a bit stronger with her mother's support. As she walked out the door, she saw her father standing by the car, his face serious but hopeful. "We'll make sure everything gets taken care of," he assured her before she left for school. When Jamila arrived at school, her heart was pounding. The school felt the same, but everything seemed different now. She kept her head down as she walked into the classroom, not wanting to draw attention to herself. Mrs. Henderson was already at the front, preparing the lesson. The teacher's gaze briefly met Jamila's, but Jamila quickly turned away, not wanting to make eye contact. Jamila took her seat quietly, feeling the eyes of some classmates on her. She couldn't tell if they were staring because of her shorter hair or if they were just curious. She hoped they wouldn't say anything, but the silence in the room made her feel uneasy. When the bell rang for the first break, Jamila gathered her things and walked to the hallway, trying to avoid any awkward conversations. But as she reached the door to the principal's office, she saw her parents waiting for her. "Jamila," her father said with a smile, "let's go. It's time to speak with the principal." The principal's office was quiet and well-lit. Principal Matthews, a tall man with glasses, sat behind his desk. He greeted Jamila's parents warmly, but quickly got down to business. Mr. Williams wasted no time explaining what had happened the day before. "Principal Matthews, something needs to be done about the way Jamila was treated yesterday," Mr. Williams said firmly. "Her teacher, Mrs. Henderson, took it upon herself to cut my daughter's hair without permission. Jamila's braids are an important part of her culture, and what happened was hurtful and wrong." Principal Matthews listened carefully but looked unsure. "I understand your concern, Mr. Williams, but the school dress code does require certain standards of grooming. We'll need to take a closer look at the situation." Mrs. Williams spoke up, her voice steady but firm. "We understand the importance of rules, Principal Matthews, but this isn't just about the dress code. It's about respecting who Jamila is and what she represents. No one should be allowed to take away her sense of identity. Jamila's heart raced as she sat there, listening to her parents talk. She was proud of them for speaking up, but a part of her felt nervous about what would happen next. Would the school do anything about it, or would it all be brushed aside? Principal Matthews nodded slowly. I hear you both, and I'll make sure we look into this. Jamila, I'm sorry this happened. We want you to feel safe and respected here. Jamila managed a small smile. Thank you, Principal Matthews. As Jamila and her parents left the office, she felt a mix of emotions. She wasn't sure what the outcome would be, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was being heard. With her parents' support, she knew they were on the right path to making things right. After the meeting with Principal Matthews, Jamila and her parents returned home. The conversation with the principal had been difficult, but it was clear that the school was taking the issue seriously. However, as Jamila sat in the living room that evening, she could still feel a sense of unease. The situation was far from over. Mr. Williams sat at the kitchen table, looking over some papers, while Mrs. Williams paced back and forth. Jamila knew her parents were both upset, but they were trying to stay calm. She couldn't help but feel anxious, wondering what would happen next. I don't know, Mr. Williams said, shaking his head. The principal said they'll look into it. But what does that really mean? How long is that going to take? Jamila's mother stopped pacing and looked at her husband. I think we need to take a stronger step. This isn't just about Jamila's hair. This is about respect. We can't let this go unnoticed. If we do, it could happen again. Mr. Williams sighed. He knew his wife was right, but taking further action meant facing more obstacles. But what if the school doesn't do anything? What if it just gets swept under the rug? Mrs. Williams sat down beside him. That's why we need to call the school board. They have the power to make real changes. If the school isn't taking this seriously enough, the school board can help us. Jamila's eyes widened as she heard her parents talk. It was clear they were determined to fight for what was right, but she wasn't sure if she was ready for the next step. What would happen if things got worse? Would they have to go in front of more people? She felt both nervous and hopeful at the same time. I think we should do it, Mrs. Williams said, her voice strong. Jamila deserves to feel proud of who she is, and no one has the right to make her feel small. The school board can make sure this doesn't happen again, not just for Jamila, but for other kids too. Jamila sat silently, thinking about her mother's words. She knew her parents were right. It wasn't just about her braids. It was about standing up for herself and for everyone else who had been treated unfairly. She didn't want anyone to feel the way she had felt when Mrs. Henderson cut her hair. She didn't want any other child to experience that kind of humiliation. Her father looked at her and smiled. What do you think, Jamila? Do you want us to take this to the school board? Jamila nodded slowly, feeling a sense of determination building inside her. Yes, I want them to know how it made me feel. I don't want anyone else to go through this. Her parents exchanged proud glances. They knew this would be a tough fight, but they were ready to do whatever it took to help their daughter. The next morning, after getting ready for school, Jamila's father made the call. He spoke firmly with the school board representative, explaining the situation in detail. The representative assured him that the board would look into it and would make sure the matter was addressed. As Jamila got ready to leave for school, her heart was filled with a mix of emotions. She felt nervous about going back, but she also felt stronger knowing that her family was standing up for her. With their support, Jamila knew she wasn't alone. She was ready to face whatever came next. The day after Mr. Williams made the call to the school board, something surprising happened. Jamila arrived at school, expecting the usual mix of classmates and teachers, but this time, the atmosphere felt different. As she walked down the hallway, she noticed students whispering to each other, and some of them even smiled at her. At first, Jamila wasn't sure why, but as she passed by a few friends, she began to understand. Jamila, "We heard what happened," said her friend Maya. "Are you okay?" Jamila nodded, though her heart still felt heavy. "I'm okay, just upset about everything that happened." Maya leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "We all think it's wrong. What Mrs. Henderson did. A lot of us are talking about it. You're not alone in this." Jamila's eyes widened in surprise. "Really?" Maya smiled. "Yeah, a lot of people are standing with you. We're all behind you." As Jamila walked into her first class, she noticed a few more students giving her kind looks. Her classmates, who had been silent the day before, now seemed to show support. Even some of the teachers who overheard the discussions seemed to express sympathy. The whispers of support were spreading fast. During recess, Jamila sat down on a bench with Maya and a few other friends. They began talking about what had happened and how wrong it was. One of her classmates, Carlos, stood up and spoke loudly enough for others to hear. "You know, we shouldn't just let this slide. We need to do something," Carlos said, his voice filled with determination. "What happened to Jamila was not okay, and I think the teachers need to learn how to respect other cultures too." Jamila felt a warm sense of gratitude. She hadn't expected her classmates to stand up so openly, but hearing them speak out made her feel less alone. It was clear that the support from her friends wasn't just about the braids. It was about standing up against something that was unfair. Later that afternoon, the school counselor, Mrs. Green, came to speak with Jamila. She had heard about the situation and wanted to make sure Jamila was doing okay. "Jamila, I want you to know that I'm really sorry this happened," Mrs. Green said gently. "I've spoken with some of the staff, and we are all committed to making sure this doesn't happen again." Jamila felt a little more at ease hearing the counselor's words. "Thank you, Mrs. Green. I just don't want anyone else to feel the way I felt." Mrs. Green smiled. "That's why we're going to make sure everyone understands what respect means. This is a learning opportunity for all of us." By the time the school bell rang to end the day, Jamila felt a small sense of relief. The support from her friends, teachers, and the counselor made the day feel a little less heavy. But even though she had more confidence now, she knew the fight wasn't over. She still had the school board to deal with, and she hoped that things would change for good. That night, Jamila's parents noticed a change in her mood. She wasn't as upset as before. She had a small smile on her face as she sat down for dinner. "You look a little better," Mrs. Williams said, noticing the change. "How was school today?" Jamila grinned. "It was better. My friends all stood up for me, and even some of the teachers are talking about what happened. I don't feel so alone anymore." Her father nodded proudly. "That's great to hear. Support is powerful. We'll keep going with our plan. But it's nice to know that others are with us." Jamila felt a little stronger with each passing day. She knew her family and friends had her back, and that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, everything would turn out okay. The day of the school board meeting arrived. Jamila woke up early, feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. Today, everything would be decided. She knew this meeting was important, but she wasn't sure what to expect. Her parents had told her that they would be discussing everything in front of the board, and Jamila hoped they would make the right decision. As Jamila and her parents drove to the meeting, she sat quietly in the back seat, trying to calm her thoughts. Her father, Mr. Williams, glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "We're almost there, Jamila. Don't worry. We're doing this together." Jamila nodded, trying to smile. She knew her parents were doing their best to comfort her, but she couldn't stop thinking about how everything had led to this moment. The teacher who had cut her braids, the pain she felt, and the way her family had fought for her, it was all building to something important. When they arrived at the school board meeting, Jamila was surprised by how many people were there. The room was filled with teachers, parents, and even some students. Everyone seemed to be watching the board members as they took their seats at the front of the room. Jamila and her family sat in the back, waiting for their turn to speak. The meeting started with introductions and discussions about various school matters. But Jamila couldn't help feeling that everyone in the room was waiting for the big issue, her case, to be brought up. Her father had already spoken to the board, and now it was time for him and her mother to share their side of the story. When it was their turn, Mr. Williams stood up first. He spoke clearly and firmly, his voice carrying through the room. My daughter Jamila is a student here at this school. She has always followed the rules and respected the dress code. But what happened to her the other day was not just about the dress code. It was about respect. Her braids are a part of who she is, a part of her culture. What happened to her was hurtful, and it should not have happened. Jamila's mother, Mrs. Williams, stood up next. We are not here to make anyone look bad, she said, her voice steady. But we are here to make sure that no student, regardless of their background, feels like they are less than anyone else. My daughter deserves to be treated with dignity. We want this to be a learning experience for everyone involved. Jamila sat quietly, listening to her parents speak. She was proud of them for standing up for her, but she also felt nervous. What if the board didn't understand? What if they didn't take the issue seriously? After Jamila's parents finished speaking, the board members began to discuss the matter. Some board members asked questions, while others nodded thoughtfully. Jamila could tell they were taking everything seriously. Finally, the board chairperson, Mrs. Thompson, spoke up. We have heard both sides of the story, and it's clear that we need to take action. This situation has brought up important issues about respect, diversity, and inclusion. We want to make sure that every student feels safe and respected in this school. Jamila held her breath as Mrs. Thompson continued. We are going to implement cultural sensitivity training for all staff members, and we will review the dress code to make sure it's fair to all students. As for Mrs. Henderson, she will receive a formal reminder about the importance of respecting students' cultural differences. Jamila's heart soared with relief. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step in the right direction. The school was listening, and they were willing to make changes. As the meeting ended, Jamila and her parents stood up. Her father put his arm around her shoulder. You did it, Jamila. You stood up for what was right. Jamila smiled, feeling a sense of pride. It wasn't just about the braids anymore. It was about making sure that no one else would have to go through what she had. The days following the school board meeting felt like a new chapter for Jamila. While it hadn't been an easy road, the support from her family, friends, and even some teachers made her feel stronger. She was proud of how things had turned out, but most of all, she felt like she had done something important, not just for herself, but for other students who might face similar challenges. When Jamila returned to school, things felt different. The atmosphere had changed. There was a sense of respect in the air, and Jamila could tell that her classmates and teachers were more aware of the importance of embracing differences. Even Mrs. Henderson, the teacher who had cut her braids, seemed to be more thoughtful in her approach. On the first day back after the meeting, Jamila was walking down the hallway when Mrs. Henderson approached her. The teacher looked a bit hesitant, but then she smiled softly. Jamila, she said quietly, I wanted to apologize again for what happened. I've learned a lot from this experience, and I want you to know that I respect your culture and your identity. Jamila was surprised by the sincerity in Mrs. Henderson's voice. She had expected an apology, but hearing it from the teacher herself made Jamila feel like things were truly changing. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson, Jamila replied, her voice steady. I'm glad you understand. I just want to be treated with respect, like everyone else. Mrs. Henderson nodded. You have every right to be proud of who you are, Jamila. I'll make sure I remember that moving forward. As Jamila walked away, she felt a sense of relief. It wasn't easy, but having an open conversation with her teacher had helped her feel more confident in her school environment. She knew that the change wouldn't happen overnight, but this was a positive step. The following weeks were filled with new learning experiences for both Jamila and her school community. The cultural sensitivity training for the staff went smoothly, and Jamila felt good knowing that her story had helped make her school a better place for everyone. Teachers were more mindful of the language they used, and the dress code was reviewed to be more inclusive. The changes, though small at first, were meaningful. Jamila's friends continued to support her, and she felt more connected to them than ever before. During lunch, Maya leaned over and whispered, "I'm so proud of you, Jamila. You stood up for what's right. And look at what's happened. You've made a difference." Jamila smiled, feeling the warmth spread through her. "Thanks, Maya. I couldn't have done it without all of you." One afternoon, as Jamila was walking home, her parents greeted her at the door with smiles on their faces. Her father, Mr. Williams, pulled her into a hug. "We're so proud of you," he said. "You showed courage, and you've made sure no one else will have to face what you did." Jamila's mother, Mrs. Williams, nodded. "You've done something really important, Jamila. You've taught us all the value of standing up for what's right." Jamila beamed. She felt proud of herself, not just for standing up to the teacher, but for helping to create a school environment where respect and kindness were the priorities. As she sat down for dinner with her family, Jamila couldn't help but smile. Things were getting better, and she knew that, even though the journey had been tough, it had been worth it. She had learned that sometimes standing up for yourself wasn't easy, but it was always the right thing to do. And in doing so, she had helped make the world around her just a little bit better. As time passed, Jamila noticed that things at school were continuing to improve. The changes that had started with her story were now becoming part of everyday life. Her classmates were more understanding and respectful of each other's differences, and the teachers were more careful about the words they used. It felt like a fresh start, not just for Jamila, but for everyone. One day during lunch, Jamila sat with her friends, talking about everything that had happened. "I can't believe how much has changed," Maya said, smiling. "It feels like a new place now." Jamila nodded, feeling the same way. "It's nice to know that it wasn't just about me. We've all learned something from this." Carlos, another friend, added, "Yeah, it's not just about the dress code. It's about treating everyone with respect, no matter what." Jamila's heart swelled with pride. She hadn't expected such a big shift in her school, but now it seemed like everyone was trying harder to be kind and understanding. She knew it hadn't been an easy road, but it was worth it. Every day, she could see how her actions had made a difference. One afternoon, as Jamila walked to class, she passed by Mrs. Henderson, who was standing outside the classroom. The teacher smiled warmly at her. "Jamila, I just wanted to say thank you again," Mrs. Henderson said. "I've learned a lot from you, and I'm proud of the way you handled everything. I hope other students can see the strength you've shown." Jamila smiled back, feeling grateful. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. I'm glad we could talk." As Jamila walked into the classroom, she felt a sense of peace. The tension that had once filled the air was now gone, replaced by a quiet understanding. She had done what she needed to do, not just for herself, but for everyone around her. At home, Jamila's parents continued to support her, and they often talked about how proud they were of her. Mr. Williams had always believed in standing up for what was right, and now Jamila shared that belief. "I'm glad you're getting the respect you deserve," her father said one evening. "You've shown us all what it means to be brave." Jamila smiled, feeling the love and pride in her parents' words. "I couldn't have done it without you both. You helped me when I needed it most." Her mother, Mrs. Williams, added, "We're so proud of you, Jamila. You've made a real difference, not just for you, but for everyone who's watching." Jamila felt proud of how far she had come. She had faced a difficult challenge and had stood up for herself and others. The support she received from her family, friends, and even some teachers had made her realize that no matter how tough things got, she wasn't alone. As the weeks passed, Jamila saw more students taking pride in their culture and expressing themselves confidently. The school was becoming a place where everyone felt valued, and Jamila knew that her bravery had played a part in that change. One day, as she walked through the school gates, Jamila thought about how far she had come. The pain of that day when her braids had been cut felt like a distant memory now. She had turned that painful moment into something positive, and in doing so, had helped create a stronger, kinder school community. Jamila smiled to herself. She was proud of who she was, and she knew that no one would ever make her feel small again. Her journey had shown her that standing up for what was right could change the world around you. One step at a time, Jamila stood at the front of the classroom, looking out at her classmates. It was the end of the school year, and the final bell would ring in just a few minutes. As she glanced around the room, she felt a sense of pride. Things had changed so much since the incident with her braids. The atmosphere was different now, more respectful and inclusive. Jamila had not only found her voice, but she had also helped her school become a place where everyone's identity was valued. Her friends, Maya and Carlos, smiled at her from their desks. They had been with her every step of the way, offering support and encouragement when she needed it most. Jamila was grateful for their friendship and knew that without them, the journey would have been much harder. As the bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Jamila gathered her things and made her way out of the classroom. She had always enjoyed school, but now it felt different. It was a place where she felt proud to be herself, where she didn't have to hide who she was or feel ashamed of her culture. When she walked through the school gates, Jamila spotted her parents waiting by the car. They waved at her with big smiles on their faces. Jamila rushed over to them, excited to share the good news about the end of the school year. She had made it through, not just as a student, but as someone who had made a real difference in her community. Her father, Mr. Williams, gave her a warm hug. "You've done an amazing job, Jamila," he said. "I'm so proud of you." Her mother, Mrs. Williams, smiled as well. "You've grown so much. This year was a tough one, but you handled it with grace and strength. You've shown us all what it means to stand up for yourself and others." Jamila smiled back at them, feeling their pride wash over her. "Thank you, Mom and Dad. I couldn't have done it without you." As they drove home, Jamila looked out the window, thinking about everything that had happened. She had learned so much this year, about standing up for herself, about the importance of respect, and about the power of having a strong support system. But most of all, she had learned that it was okay to be who you are, even when the world around you doesn't always understand. The next day, Jamila sat down at the kitchen table with her parents, excited to talk about the summer plans. She felt at peace knowing that the changes in her school would continue long after the school year ended. She knew that the cultural sensitivity training and the dress code review would help future students feel respected, just as she had hoped. The work wasn't over, but Jamila felt confident that the world was moving in the right direction. "I'm excited for what comes next," Jamila said as she looked at her parents. "I'm ready for whatever challenges come my way. I know I can handle them now." Mr. Williams smiled. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Jamila nodded. She had proven to herself that she was strong, brave, and capable of making a difference. With the love and support of her family, she knew she could take on anything. As she sat back and relaxed, Jamila realized that this was just the beginning of her journey. She had already shown what it meant to stand up for herself, and she was ready to keep growing, learning, and inspiring others along the way.